China didn't just cover a dead desert in solar panels. It roofed 609 square kilometers of Qinghai's Gonghe Basin, and under that roof, grass came back. By 2015, engineers had planted enough panels to power 1 million homes. By 2020, the bare ground was over 50% greener, and shepherds grazed 10,000 sheep between the rows. Like shade cloth thrown over a farmer's seedbed, the array cooled the sand, blocked the wind, and quietly turned a desert into pasture. So how did a power plant accidentally grow a garden? Start with the ground itself. Gonghe Basin sits at roughly 2,900 meters on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, high enough that the air feels thin and the sun feels closer than it should. The basin lies within Hainan, Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in Qinghai Province, centered near Gonghe County, home to fewer than 130,000 people spread across a landscape more sky than soil. Decades of wind had stripped the topsoil, and evaporation ran far ahead of rainfall, a paltry 300 millimeters a year, against an evaporation rate that studies from the 1980s put above 1,700 millimeters annually. Herders who once ran flocks across this land had mostly walked away, chased out by sand encroachment that swallowed old grazing routes whole. By the early 2000s, local agricultural surveys classified nearly a third of the basin's grassland as severely or extremely degraded. One retired herder, Tsering Dorje, later told visiting researchers he'd moved his family and animals twice in the 1990s, just chasing grass that kept vanishing. Officials wrote the basin off in policy terms. Too degraded to farm, too degraded even to herd. That baseline is worth holding on to, because nothing about what came next was supposed to happen here. That written-off land is exactly what engineers went looking for. Nobody had to fight a farmer or flood a village to build here, which made the basin politically easy, even as it stayed physically brutal. Construction on the Longyangshe Dam Solar Park started in 2013, right beside the Yellow River's hydro station, stacking panels on ground too poor for crops or livestock. State Power Investment Corporation, the state-owned developer behind the project, paired the array with the existing one, 280-megawatt Longyangshe hydropower station, creating what engineers called a hydro-solar complementary system capable of smoothing output when clouds passed overhead. The first phase alone installed roughly 320 megawatts of capacity across 2013 and 2014 at a reported cost exceeding 4.6 billion yuan, before later phases pushed installed capacity past 850 megawatts by 2015. The project grew into the wider Talaton Solar Park, eventually spreading across roughly 609 square kilometers of basin floor and incorporating more than 4 million individual solar panels. Combined, the arrays were built to power about 1 million households. A station sized like a small country, sitting on land nobody thought had any other use left in it. A power station was supposed to stay exactly that. Glass, steel, and wire, nothing more. Then, around 2015 and 2016, maintenance crews walking the rows started noticing green where there used to be only sand and grit. Site engineer Ma Jianfeng, who logged inspection routes for the eastern panel blocks, later recalled photographing the strips because he assumed a pipe had leaked. The grass wasn't scattered randomly. It ran in tight rows, matching the shaded strips beneath each line of panels, as if someone had planted it on purpose. Site managers logged the observation, shrugged, and moved on, treating it as a local fluke rather than a pattern worth chasing, until researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences Northwest Institute of Eco-Environment and Resources visited in 2017 and began systematic soil and vegetation sampling across marked plots. It would take scientists, not maintenance logs, to work out what the panels were actually doing to the ground beneath them. What the panels were doing was acting like farm shade cloth stretched across the desert floor, and the first clue was in the wind. Instruments in the array recorded ground-level wind speed cut by roughly 30 to 50% under the panels compared to open ground nearby, with anemometers placed at 20-centimeter height, showing average speeds dropping from about 4.5 meters per second in open basin to under 2.5 meters per second beneath the rows. Less wind meant less sand on the move, and less sand on the move meant the topsoil finally stopped being stripped away, a slow bleed that had defined the basin for decades. Researchers measured sediment transport rates falling by more than 60% in shaded transects compared to unshaded control plots surveyed the same season. It's the same trick a windbreak or shade cloth fence pulls off in any farmer's field, calming the air long enough for something fragile to survive its first season. Gonghe's panels weren't generating electricity from wind, but they were still spending it, quietly, to change the ground beneath them. That effect didn't stop at wind. A second one stacked on top, this time about heat. Shaded soil under the panels ran several degrees cooler than exposed dirt just a few meters away, with recorded differences of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in surface soil temperature during peak summer readings taken in July 2018, a difference small enough to miss by hand but large enough to matter to a seed. Cooler ground combined with calmer air to slow evaporation dramatically, and researchers logged soil moisture content roughly 20 to 30% higher beneath panel rows than in open ground during the same sampling period. In a place where 300 millimeters of rain a year is the entire annual budget, every extra hour of retained moisture counts double. That extra time was enough. Native seeds that had sat dormant in the dirt for years, waiting out a drought with no expiration date, finally had the window they needed to germinate. Germinating seeds don't usually rewrite a landscape alone, but at Gonghe's scale, with millions of shaded strips acting in unison, they did. Inside the fenced panel zones, vegetation coverage climbed from under 20% to over 80% across several surveyed sections within just a few years. Specific plots monitored between 2013 and 2018 went from roughly 17% coverage to as high as 82%, according to figures cited by Chinese state media outlet Xinhua in 2019. A jump most restoration programs would need decades and a heavy budget to match. Species identified in the recovering strips included native perennial grasses like stipa and poa, alongside patches of artemisia shrub reclaiming ground that surveys a decade earlier had marked as bare sand. Nobody reseeded by hand, laid irrigation pipe, or trucked in water. The green cover followed the geometry of the panel rows, not the natural contours of the land. The clearest signature that this was the array's doing, not some lucky rainy year. A power plant built on dead ground had, without anyone planning it, become a nursery. A nursery is not what a solar company sets out to build, and the grass soon turned from curiosity into a genuine maintenance headache. Left unchecked, growth reached heights of 50 to 70 centimeters in some sections by 2016. High enough to shade the lowest panels and scrape against their surfaces with every gust, chipping at equipment never designed to share space with a living thing. Tall, dry grass beneath high-voltage equipment is also a fire risk no operator wants to explain after the fact, and plant managers reported at least 2 small grass fires near transformer stations during the dry autumn of 2016 before mitigation measures were put in place. Mowing hundreds of square kilometers of desert by hand or machine was neither cheap nor realistic at this scale. Internal estimates put manual clearing costs at several million yuan annually if pursued across the full 609 square kilometer site. The panels had grown a garden by accident, and now somebody had to figure out how to tend it without losing the savings they were built to generate. Tending a garden of this size called for the oldest tool on the plateau, not the newest one in an engineering catalog. Local herders were invited back onto land many had abandoned a decade earlier, this time to graze flocks between and beneath the panel rows instead of across open range. Reports describe close to 10,000 sheep working the Gonghe solar fields, cropping the grass to a manageable height without a mower touching the ground, with local cooperatives organizing grazing rotations starting around 2017, so panel rows were cleared on a roughly 6-week cycle. Herders earned income again from land officially written off years before. One grazing family, the Lamos, reportedly saw annual income climb by several thousand yuan after signing on to manage a section of the array in 2018. And the panels stayed clear of overgrowth without adding a maintenance contract. Someone started calling them photovoltaic sheep, half as a joke, and the name stuck because it turned out to be accurate. The sheep did more than protect hardware, and this is where the story stops being just about grass. Shorter grass and constant animal movement reduced the wind-blown dust that settled on panel surfaces, keeping them cleaner without a crew scrubbing glass across 609 square kilometers. Plant operators estimated dust-related efficiency losses dropped by several percentage points compared to earlier seasons before grazing began. The added vegetation and retained soil moisture measurably lowered the ambient temperature around the arrays by an estimated 1 to 2 degrees Celsius on average during summer months, echoing that same shade cloth logic from a different angle. Cooler panels convert sunlight into electricity, more efficiency than overheated ones. Engineers cited efficiency gains in the range of 2 to 5% under cooler operating conditions. So a flock of sheep chewing grass was, in a roundabout way, nudging up the power output of a solar farm. Nobody designed that outcome on a spreadsheet. It simply fell out of getting the wind, heat, and moisture right, then trusting an old profession to manage what grew from it. Getting the wind, heat, and moisture right in one basin isn't the same as proving it works everywhere else. That was the real test. Whether Gongche's recovery was a one-off accident of geography or a formula that could travel to harder, drier ground. Similar solar plus vegetation projects pushed into Inner Mongolia's Kubuki Desert and Ningxia's Tengger Desert, both with long histories of sand swallowing usable land. The Kubuki project, developed in part by Elian Resources Group starting around 2017, eventually covered more than 20 square kilometers, with panels paired directly with cash crops. In Kubuki, panel fields were paired deliberately with drought-hardy crops like licorice and wolfberry, planted to take advantage of the shade, the way Gonghe's grass had taken advantage of it by accident, with licorice root harvests reportedly generating meaningful secondary income for local farming cooperatives by 2019. In Tengger, similar arrays begun near Zhongwei, Ningxia, in the mid-2010s combined photovoltaic fields with sand-fixing straw checkerboard grids, a technique dating back to the 1950s that Chinese engineers had used for decades before solar entered the picture. Success at each new site depended on matching the right plants and grazing pressure to that site's own water table, because shade cloth only helps a seed bed that still has moisture underneath it worth protecting. Matching plants to water tables across a desert is hard to verify from the ground alone, so researchers turned to vegetation index tracking across several of these solar parks. The data showed comparable increases in ground cover at multiple sites, not just the basin that started the story. The difference between an anecdote and a method. These programs stacked power generation, grazing income, and erosion control onto the same land, 3 outputs from one investment instead of the usual one. But the balance stayed fragile everywhere it was tested, and some overgrazed or overplanted plots slid back toward bare ground when nobody watched the numbers closely enough. A repeatable formula still needed a hand on the wheel at every site, not just the first one that made headlines. That hand on the wheel is what turned farm shade cloth over dead sand into a functioning industry rather than a lucky one-time result. The model now links electricity generation, livestock grazing, and desertification control on the same site. 3 jobs done by a single piece of infrastructure that used to do only one. Communities downwind report fewer dust storms rolling off destabilized topsoil, a benefit that never shows up on a power bill, but matters enormously to anyone who has swept sand out of a doorway every morning of their life. China's approach is now studied abroad as a template for solar development in other arid regions, from parts of the Sahel to stretches of the American Southwest facing the same math of scarce rain and relentless wind. In, he, desert. Shade became rain. Gonghe proved that a power plant can double as a windbreak, a water trap, and a pasture, without anyone drawing that outcome up on the original blueprint. Whether that makes solar farms the cheapest desertification tool humanity has stumbled onto, or just a lucky accident dressed up afterward as a strategy, is still an open argument worth having. Do you think this model scales into the world's other deserts? Or does Gonghe stay a one-of-a-kind fluke of altitude and rainfall that got lucky once? Drop your take in the comments, and if this kind of story is your thing, stick around and subscribe for the next one.